In my ancestral village near Mavelikara, which is a lovely place with the most fascinating stories and groves and all kinds of wonderful places around it, there's an old family of Nasrani Christians, Syrian Christians. And as some of you might know, Nasranis were seen as a high status group, very much like upper caste Hindu communities. In fact, many Nasrani families claim descent from Brahmins, and their customs share aspects with elite Hindus and their practices. Now, the interesting thing is this. In our part of Kerala, it was customary that any time some oil or ghee was brought into a temple or into Orthodox Hindu homes, it was important that it had to be purified first by the touch of a Nasrani. എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ഘീയോ അമ്പലത്തിൻ്റെ ഭരണികളൊക്കെ അമ്പലങ്ങളിലൊക്കെ വരുമ്പം അത് നസ്രാനി വന്ന് തൊട്ടാലേ അകത്തോട്ട് ശുദ്ധമായിട്ട് എടുക്കാൻ പറ്റുള്ളൂ. And according to the Hindu communities in my ancestral village, it was for this purpose that this particular family was brought there some 200-300 years ago. And that was the main role that they had, to play a role in the temple. But if you ask members of the Nasrani family themselves their history, they have a slightly different version. While they do acknowledge this custom of purifying the ghee, they state that they came to the village in another context. The village has what is called a padanilam. The village itself, in fact, it stands on the borders of two Natirajams, Kayangulam and Pandalam. And according to the family, they were brought there not to purify oil, but as warriors. Their ancestors were famed fighters, and it was in order to train the local Nayars that they were brought here. The Shuddhigiring of the ghee was a secondary byproduct of their presence, but that was not the primary reason that they came here. One can sense a minor tension here. Did they come to serve the local Hindu elites in the temple? Or did they, as their own account goes, come to teach the local Hindu elites? Each group remembers the past in its own way, and perhaps in ways that serve their own status claims. And when I say status claims, I don't mean just then, but also in the present. How you remember things is also how you project your own image and your own identity today. But think of it more broadly. If in my own small village tucked away among so many in Kerala, there is no consensus on the origin of a single family, just imagine the debates, disputes, and quarrels that are likely to form about the larger questions. About the nation, about religion, identity, wars, historical figures, and political history. But why does history matter at all? To start with, it is all around us. If you just take a small glass of water, on the face of it, it's water, plain and simple. Just vellathinte glass aana. But not very long ago, it represented a lot more. There were people who could not serve water to others. And there were people who would not drink water served by certain castes and communities. In fact, as Mahatma Phule wrote sarcastically in Maharashtra in the late 19th century, there were men who would happily drink cow's urine, but would refuse clean water from people of lower caste. In many parts of India, this has now changed. But in many parts, it has not. A glass of water is still not just water, but a ritual transaction. It is still used not just to quench thirst, but to assert power. To remind people of who they are, where they stand in the hierarchy, and how they must behave. Or as the Hindi expression goes, what their awqad is. So that's why there's so much history encapsulated in a simple glass of water. And not all of it is pleasant. Today, some of us have the privilege of picking up this glass without caring where did this water come from, what is the name and caste of the person who brought it here. Because it's because people in the past fought for this. There is a history to how a glass of water becomes just a glass of water, as opposed to an instrument of social and ritual status assertion. And again, I can speak to a great degree in the past tense about this. But for many people in this country, this is still something that happens in the present tense. For them, the battle is not yet over. History, that is, overlaps into our own time. These changes, of course, over a period of time do occur. But when they do occur, they don't occur overnight. They do take their time. I remember in my own family hearing about how the rules slowly shifted and changed over a period as exposure grew, and these old rituals were sort of watered down. My grandmother's oldest brother is 18 years senior. He passed away at the age of 102. In his time, when he returned from school, he had to take a dip in the column first and enter the house shirtless, because the shirt was considered brushed. It was considered a foreign object, so you couldn't wear it when you sat down to have your meal. And each time anyone went to a public place and returned, they had to go and take a dip in the kolam. This was in the 1920s and 30s. By the time my grandmother was growing up, in the mid-40s, late 1940s, the rules had been amended. When she came back from school, all she had to do was to stand there with an olakuda. Somebody would come with a pot of water and pour the water over the olakuda. That way you could claim to have become pure, but without the inconvenience of actually getting wet. By the time she was in her 20s, even this nonsensical shortcut ritual had already been removed, and that was the end of it. But to come back to my earlier question, history matters because it is everywhere. It is in the shape of our cities, in the structure and design of our buildings, in the fabric we wear, in the languages we speak, and even in our emotional lives and experiences. Childhood trauma, for instance, can scar a person for their whole life. Social and historical trauma also can work along similar lines. Communities and people remember the past in various, even conflicting ways, and draw meaning for themselves in the present from this. And this is precisely why history is also a political, politicized commodity, not merely a matter of academic or general inquiry. But when we speak of history, whose history do we speak of? Like most things in life, this is a complex, layered phenomenon. And in a diverse society, there can never be just one prism through which we view the world. To illustrate, take colonialism. As a phenomenon, it has been around the world a violent, repressive process. It has demolished native institutions, redrawn lines on the map, cut up communities, caused serious crises of identity, and the pain it leaves in its wake can often last generations. We, for instance, gained freedom in 1947, but even now live with so many small and big colonial influences. The very fact that I am most comfortable expressing myself in English is proof of this. But equally, colonialism also brought in dynamics that resulted in what we might call constructive change. In many ways, it forced us to introspect, reflect, and discard elements of our own culture that were patently problematic. It was under colonial rule that Dalits, for example, were able to access modern education and organize themselves in potent new political ways. Gandhiji discarded the white man's three-piece suit to dress like an Indian peasant, making a powerful political statement this way. But Ambedkar did the reverse. He wore and flaunted the suit because to him as a Dalit, it was a sign of empowerment. Gandhiji had the privilege and social capital to discard European garments for the loincloth. For him, there was an element of choice. Ambedkar's ancestors had no option but to wear the loincloth for centuries. To him, the suit represented not imperialism, but a sense of dignity. It was a breath of fresh air and liberty. So depending on where you stand and what your own experiences are, the same phenomenon assumes a different appearance. And to be honest, both of these positions are equally valid. Gandhi represented the dissent of a nation against an oppressive colonizing power. Ambedkar challenged oppressive structures within the nation. We do not always have to choose one over the other. They can both be part of our shared historical and larger understanding. In fact, this is the one thing we can say with certainty about history. It rarely delivers easy answers. What it does deliver are complications to ponder over. It does not offer comfort all the time. Instead, it can shake us, challenging our very view of the world and even ourselves. Good history in the end is that which makes us think. If on the other hand, one uses history to merely confirm biases, then something is amiss. But when we say whose history, another point I've noticed is also gender. We work with sources that are more often than not written by men, for audiences that were male, which also amplify the male perspective. So while women played very important political roles in history, they were often written out of it. Or when they were written about, it was in the form of footnotes as marginal forces and minor figures. I should know, my very first book was about Setu Lakshmibai of Travancore. She was a woman of privilege and wealth. She was not marginalized in terms of caste or class, but she was marginalized on the basis of gender. A brief survey of the facts reveal a great irony. This lady ruled Travancore for 7 years between 1924 and 31. It was admittedly a brief slot. Yet at the time of Travancore's integration in 1949-50, that period, officials like M.K. Vellodi observed, like several British officers before him, that she was the most popular person in the erstwhile Travancore dynasty. And this even though she had given up power nearly 20 years before. Meanwhile, an analysis of documents shows that her nephew, Chitrairnal, the last Maharaja, was deeply unpopular by the time he gave up power. In fact, his Diwan Sir CP in a letter even warns him that there might be danger to the Raja's life in the late 1940s. And yet today in Thiruvananthapuram, there's a whole cult of Rajabhakti built up around Chitrairnal. As for Sethu Lakshmi Bai, she is forgotten. There is not one memorial to her, even though in her own time she was the one praised for helming a progressive, fair and economically robust administration. And even though through the 1930s and 40s, British and Indian observers both noticed that she was the one member of the royal family who was actually admired by the public. From today's perch, it looks like Chitradirnal was the most popular person then. There are statues to him, awards in his name and regular public functions. The historical truth, though, is somewhat different. And the person who was actually popular in the historical record with the people is a mere footnote. A good part of this was because she was a woman in a world of men. Scholar Arik Moran's study of Rajput hill states shows similar ironies. Rajput women were active political agents, and yet the conventional ways in which they were written about were such that they were reduced to mere footnotes. I often mention the case of Mughal Begums as well. Earlier generations of historians assumed that the harem was just an unimportant place. If anything, it was a negative influence. It took feminist research to demonstrate that the harem was a political institution and that Mughal Begums were economic powerhouses, diplomats, and formidable forces in their own right in the imperial court. We simply missed their stories because we were not looking for these stories. Our own conditioning sometimes eclipses things while emphasizing others. No record of the past is perfect, and sometimes to understand history fully, we need to look not only at what the record says, but what it omits. We must read between the lines and observe not just the statements that are available in the record, but also the silences. For often the most interesting bits, the most fascinating questions around history lie in these spaces, in these gaps. But even when there are no evident gaps, when there's a surplus of sources, one must still ask questions. Take, for example, the study of historical figures. The King Martandavarma is a prime example. As many of you might know, in the 18th century, he conquered a series of states in southern Kerala and established Travancore. His conquests are violent and bloody. In his own lifetime and that of his heirs down to the 19th century, there was even some embarrassment about this. His nephew, for example, lamented on his deathbed that going to hell is unavoidable. I can never forget the horrors to which we have been parties during those wars. In fact, the Travancore Rajas surrendered their kingdom to their deity, Sri Padmanabha Swami, in the famous act of Trippadidanam. It was partly to escape this moral burden and odium. But how do the records present Martandavarma? If I take the Bala Martanda Vijaya, a Sanskrit source, I see one version of the man. In this, he is a dharmic king who is keen to renounce the material world and purely serve his deity. It is the deity who comes to him and asks him to conquer kingdoms and amass treasure. Why? So that the Padmanabha Swami temple can be rebuilt. In this chronicle, in other words, Martandavarma's deeds are justified as part of a divine mandate. He spilled blood, waged wars and conquered territories, but all in the service of God. It's a very neat, convenient little explanation. On the other hand, leaving aside the Bala Martanda Vijaya, there's an oral tradition among a marginalized caste in Travancore called the Thambimar Kadhe. And we see a different Martandavarma in this particular account. Here he's presented as a cunning figure, a man who breaks promises, who lusts for women and so on. The dharmic king becomes an ultra-villain in this narrative, and all his actions are led by self-interest and personal glorification. This source sits at the other extreme from the Bala Martanda Vijaya. In the Thambimar Kadhe, all that Martandavarma does is evil. He's presented not as a divine agent, but as a horrible, comprehensively flawed human being. By the 20th century, meanwhile, Darbar historians felt they had to justify Martandavarma in one more way. So we find a third interpretation in which Martandavarma conquers all these states in Kerala, and that is to save Kerala. He feared, we are told, that the region would land under colonial rule, and it is to prevent this that he decides to unite the area under a strong Indian leadership, his own. Or put another way, he did what he did out of almost nationalist impulses. Here there's a degree of projection. Nationalist values from a later period are projected backwards onto an 18th century monarch. But either way, as per this narrative, Martandavarma is not merely a local king, but a national pan-Indian icon. So who then was the real Martandavarma? Was he a humble servant of God on a divine mission? Was he a ruthless conqueror who in some sources and narratives is shown even plundering temples? Or was he a visionary leader who wanted to protect Kerala from European powers? The historian's job is not necessarily to answer these questions with one definite conclusion. It is not to select one option as if this is a multiple choice question with only one single answer. The historian's role is to understand what these perspectives seek to communicate and then to try and make sense of Martandavarma in his own context. So was he cruel? Yes, he was. Was he devoted to his deity? Also true, though this narrative was used to paper over and justify some of his less than noble deeds as well. Some of the early Darbar chronicles in fact openly acknowledge this. Did he take a negative view of foreign powers like the Dutch? Absolutely. At the end of the day, he was a strong king and strong kings tend to be ruthless. The dedication of his kingdom to his deity came later. At first, for nearly 2 decades, the man had a very violent career. We see something similar with Akbar too. In his early years, he was a great conqueror, and like all conquerors, he could be cruel. The Akbar we celebrate today, however, emerged after this, after his power was secure. Context ultimately is critical in making sense of the past. And once we learn to look at historical figures in their context, we escape the desire to identify everyone in history as either a hero or a villain. But what about the sources themselves? There was a time when written documents were privileged over all else. But we must remember that in our society, divided by caste, class, and several such factors, access to literacy and written material was a very elite affair. Much of our consciousness of the past is actually preserved in oral history. So today, historians must work with diverse sources, oral accounts, art, architecture, and so on. But even with sophisticated written sources, one must be willing to examine them critically. For instance, I always find the official Travancore state publications very amusing. In the 1850s, there was a real fear that the state would be annexed by the British on the charge of misgovernment. To prevent this, the Rajas began actively to promote an image as modern rulers, as men of progress and of good governance. One part of this strategy involved publishing yearly records in the English language, detailing all kinds of things. How many new schools were opened, how many new bridges were constructed, how many roads were constructed, and so on. Today, some people take these at face value and say how wonderful, how progressive, how much was achieved. Yes, at a broad level, compared to a lot of the other princely rulers of the time, the Travancore rulers were better. But we must also watch against falling for propaganda. A lot of the things written in these documents existed just on paper. For instance, roads were thrown open formally to all castes in the 1920s under Sethu Lakshmi Bai. I remember asking people in my own ancestral village about this. They all answered that in reality, roads became accessible only in the 1950s, well after independence. That is, yes, the Travancore government issued orders opening roads to all castes, but in practice, officials on the ground or on the local level did not always implement those orders as they came. So we must credit the Rani certainly for taking the right step, but we must also be aware that the system itself was such that not everything decided in Trivandrum was enacted on the ground by people. This sort of thing happens even today. Every time we meet a problem, whether it's related to women's safety, education, or something else, we create a fresh law. On paper, it sounds wonderful, but we lack the state capacity to actually implement these laws. Similarly, governments produce data that creates certain impressions. It is good journalism that helps us look at the granular details until we realize that the picture is not as handsome as the government presents it. In a sense, the historian's job is similar, except that we aren't uncovering the present, but the past. And the past had its own forms of propaganda. That is a reality we have to live with. Everybody who created documents, everybody who commissioned chronicles, they pretended to tell the objective truth, but in reality, it was their truth, not the truth. So to go back to my earlier example, as much as the Bala Martanda Vijaya offers one type of truth in which Martandavarma is a noble, pavam figure, the Thambimar Kadha at the other end is not objective either, in its abject villainization. Both represent two different interests, one royalist, the other anti-royal. A good historian should be able to analyze both without getting swayed. We do not always succeed. After all, historians are also human beings, but we must certainly attempt to move in that direction. Speaking of swayed, religion is the other big issue in history, one that causes all kinds of debates and disputes and sees historians branded in certain ways. In my own case, depending on which of my 4 books people have read, they have said different things. With my first book, a Travancore royal descendant on stage at a literature festival in Trivandrum some years ago said that it was an anti-Hindu book. With my book on the Sultans of the Deccan, I was called a Muslim appeaser. But when my fourth book came, some people said I'd become pro-Hindu. I have a fifth one scheduled for December, and I'm very curious what people will call me after that. The fact is that as we study complex subjects, different things are highlighted. But because most people in the world prefer simplistic answers, instead of looking at the substance of the matter, we are tempted to reduce things to black and white. In India at present, for example, we have two broad contemporary claims. One refuses to even acknowledge that there was any kind of religious animosity in Indian history. Until the colonial period, we were all getting along fabulously and the country was some kind of pluralistic paradise. In contrast, we have another narrative today in which all of history is viewed as some kind of dramatic religious and civilizational war. Everything is perceived through the lens of religion. The facts, however, show something that sits in the middle. At elite levels and in political spaces, we do find religious animosity and suspicion from quite early on in Indian history, especially between Hindus and Muslims. Political as well as literary material hints at this, writings such as Vidyapati in the 14th century, Eknath in the 16th century, and so on. But does this mean that most people were fighting all the time? No, they still managed to get along and actively share in each other's faith and cultures. In other words, life was complex back then just as it is complex today. If 300 years from now, somebody were to just pick up the speeches of a certain politician of a certain party and assume that they could make sense of contemporary India through those speeches, they would assume that Hindus and Muslims were constantly fighting in the 21st century India. Those speeches do hint at the tensions, yes, but they do not reflect the pushback, the resistance to identity politics, and the other counter-narratives that exist. For that, we have to look elsewhere. For a fuller picture, we must always widen our sources and try and gather as many voices as possible. To give a historical example, it is true that Chhatrapati Shivaji in Maharashtra cast himself as a Hindu hero. In the Shiva Bharata, a Sanskrit work commissioned in his own lifetime, he is presented as Vishnu reborn to rid the earth of Muslim rule. It is hard to ignore the religious tone here. At the same time, a number of Maratha chronicles, or the Bakhars, note that his father and uncle were named after a Muslim pir. His father's name was Shahaji, his uncle's name was Sharifji, and they were named after Shah Sharif of Ahmednagar. The story goes that his grandparents were unable to have children. They finally go to this pir, and it is through his blessings that they end up having the sons, and therefore the sons are named after Shah Sharif. That is, it was entirely possible on a day-to-day basis for people to get along and participate in one another's religious cultures. But equally, when it came to power and politics, religion could be used to assert a very different idea. Something we still see in our politics to this day, where religion is used instrumentally. I also give the example often of Tipu Sultan of Mysore. Within Mysore, he patronized Brahmins, gave grants to temples, and sent Shivlingams to Sringeri asking that puja should be done to them. But when he invaded Malabar, it is true that he used, in the same period, religious rhetoric to justify conquest. The same man in two different geographical spaces behaved very differently. This suggests that both impulses were in play. It was only that they were applied selectively and not uniformly. And we should not fall into the trap of siding with either extreme. If there was religious animosity, it must be admitted and examined. Just because something happened in the past, something that makes us unhappy or uncomfortable, we should not try to brush it away or dismiss it as irrelevant. In fact, a proper historical understanding can sometimes be perverted by good intentions. Many people deny religious tensions in the medieval period because they fear that it will be used to justify present-day religious conflicts. The fear is certainly valid because there are people out to do this. But my own view is that we must tackle these complicated subjects head-on. It is by avoiding them that we create room for these themes to be misappropriated, for things to be exaggerated, and for them to be turned into political fodder. As the old saying goes, sunlight really is the best disinfectant. The more we know, the more transparently we study and analyze things, the better it is for everyone. But while religion is a serious affair, sometimes history also offers amusing, snarky, even mischievous content. As I indicated before, different communities and group interests construct the past in ways that reflect their own causes, and all kinds of narratives therefore circulate. They do not reflect the truth, and yet they convey ideas that these groups and peoples wish to disseminate. In this regard, some stories that I have heard come to mind. One oral account I was told some years ago was about Srinarayana Guru and Sethu Lakshmi Bai, the Maharani of Travancore, in the 1920s. It claims that the Rani was very keen to meet the Guru and to obtain a darshan. She sent him a message at Varkala and even offered to send him her car so that he could be brought to her beach palace. But the Guru declined the invitation. As a spiritual master, he was above kings and that kind of space. All the same, the story continues, he wanted to fulfill the Rani's desire by giving her a darshan. So one day he walked down the beach near the palace so she would see him from afar. According to this tale, the Rani saw him from her window and then ran towards the cliff shouting, "Guruve, Guruve," hoping to speak to him. But the Guru returned quickly. She got her darshan, albeit from a distance. She had to see him on his terms, not the other way around. Now please keep this story in mind for a moment. I will tell you another one. This story circulated among Nayars in my village. It claims that Sri Narayana Guru was not really a great yogi or a spiritual figure. He was a mere charlatan who wanted to boost the Irava community outside beyond all proportion. The Guru had, it continues, predicted that he would die or attain samadhi on a certain day at a certain time. But because he was not a true sannyasi, these Nayars claim, on the appointed day, nothing happened. It looked like he would live on. So in the end, to save face, his own disciples took a stone or a coconut and beat him to death. And then they claimed that the Guru had attained samadhi. Now both of these are farcical stories circulated in two very different groups. The first story with the Maharani shouting "Guruve, Guruve" was an Irava account, and its goal was to demonstrate that Sri Narayana Guru was such a remarkable, magnetic, charismatic figure that even the Queen of Travancore lost all composure in his presence and ran to be with him. The other story was slander by the Nayars, who have had something of a rivalry with the Irava community over the last 200 years, designed to denigrate the Guru and to show that he was not actually as big as he is made out to be. Both stories have masala. Having researched Sethu Lakshmi Bai's life, she is very unlikely to have run up a hill shouting the Guru's name. With the other tale, we know that the Guru died of illness. Some say tuberculosis, some say cancer, and not because anybody beat him to death. But both stories nevertheless represent certain claims and ideas that two rival groups wanted to. As a whole, after all, is a land of stories and storytellers. Funnily enough, there's a third narrative. The Travancore royals in Kaudiya Palace claim that before the birth of Sri Chitradirnal, Narayana Guru issued a prophecy, namely that a royal infant would be born and that he would be the savior of the Iravas. This is linked to the temple entry proclamation that Chitradirnal passed in 1936. The idea is to suggest that the whole thing was a play of destiny. But what is the historical reality? The Iravas actually agitated for decades to obtain their rights. It was finally out of fear that the Iravas would convert to another religion and leave the Hindu fold that the Maharaja opened up the temples to retain the community in the Hindu fold. His hand, for all practical purposes, was forced by Irava political assertion. This complicated history, though, is nicely brushed under the carpet by this story, which instead offers a neater, more romantic account. By making the Maharaja a savior figure and by claiming that Sri Narayana Guru himself prophesied this, it transfers credit for radical change from the Irava masses actually on the ground and places it in the hands of the royals. It takes away Irava agency of several generations, years of protest and political activism, and reduces it to divine destiny. If credit belongs to anyone, it seems to suggest, it was to God who brought Chitradirnal into the world to save the Iravas. So as you can see, different interests offer different tales. All of this is material for the historian to understand the broader political impulses they represent. Through these, we can see the aims and agendas of various groups, but also their anxieties and fears. These stories don't tell us much of value on the face of it, but they do convey to us what agitated and worried some of these people, and in that, there is scholarly value. Now, I must confess that as I was writing this last segment that I just spoke of, I did worry whether some people might misinterpret my words and think that I believe in these stories or I am endorsing these stories in some way. This is the other thing with doing history at present, the fear of so-called hurt sentiments. We've always had a passion for this in our country, but today this business of taking offense has truly become our national sport. I was in my mid-20s when my first book was published. Sometime later, I received a defamation notice from Kaudiya Palace demanding 5 crores in damages. I had 0 crores to give, and I sent back a counter demonstrating that all the so-called objectionable material had come from solid archival sources. The matter was dropped, but it was an early lesson in the perils of attempting to communicate history in a certain way, especially when it goes after received wisdom or long-established, well-entrenched narratives. One always wonders, therefore, who will be upset this time? Who will use this to make personal accounts? I'm not saying I'm perfect or that my conclusions are the only conclusions possible, but there is certainly a shrinking of space, and without doubt, I know of many writers who speak of self-censorship creeping into their own work. As I said earlier, I have a new book scheduled for December this year, and for the first time in my 15 years now of writing and 10 years of publishing, the manuscript, even before it went to the editorial and to the editorial team at my publishers, it was sent for a legal read. The lawyer sent me notes on the most minor things. They were only doing their job and being thorough, but it showed me how extremely cautious everybody has become. Fear is, in fact, infectious. And that is the tragedy. For if we cannot speak freely, openly, and fearlessly discuss our past, how are we going to freely, openly, and fearlessly shape our future? But this is not a question that historians alone can answer. We are all part of this, and we must all find our way together. I leave you with that thought. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for your kindness for listening to this.